Um, I'm really excited to be talking here with you guys today. My name is Angela Guzman, and I'm an entrepreneur and designer based out of Silicon Valley. And before I get started on my topic, I just want to say thank you to everyone at ADDC for the invitation to come share my story, the topic that I'll be discussing with you guys today, but also to everyone that I've met throughout the last couple of days at events here held in Barcelona. I've had a lot of fun getting to know some of you. So, kind of to kick things off, I want to first start by asking a question. And that's, how in the world did an 8-year-old girl from Colombia who didn't speak a word of English end up working in the heart of Silicon Valley? And well, the answer for that really is the answer to my story, how I got to be 8, moved to the US, worked in tech for well over a decade. And in order to do so, kind of in the nutshell, what I did was being fearlessly forward. And that's what this topic that I'll be sharing with you guys means. It's also what has become my intuitive approach to Silicon Valley. And so before I jump into the details of how this whole thing has happened, I just want to give you a little background as to who I am. I'm currently the founder and CEO of my startup called Tijiko, which I'll touch a little bit on at the end of my talk. Throughout my career in Silicon Valley, I have been a UX design lead for a number of companies, an individual contributor, a manager, and so on. And throughout my time, I've always enjoyed being a design mentor. And up to now, I continue to do this. So if you guys are interested, by all means, contact me via my website and other modes, and we can get going on that. Occasionally, I'm also a startup advisor. So if anybody wants some feedback on design for your startup, I'm also very happy to give you my thoughts. And the other thing that I do kind of on the side is I love to write. And so I kind of consider myself a small writer on the side. And most recently, in the last 2 years or so, I've become a mom, which I'm very excited about. So excited that my son gets to have this designer mom who makes some crazy birthday parties with race car piñatas and box carts. So I'm very excited to be able to use my talent in other modes. And the other things that I do for fun sometimes is I love to dress up my little Chihuahua rescue and make little costumes for her. If you want to know more about these kinds of adventures, by all means, find me on Instagram at Miss Little Pixie. Pixie is her name. And you can see more things that we do together. But anyway, side stories aside, the other really awesome thing that has happened in the last, I guess, year and a half has been an array of interviews that have come my way from a number of media outlets from all over the world. These were not things I looked for. These were requests kind of coming my way. Places like the Times of India, which is a large media outlet in India. Places in Colombia like Caracol or W Radio. Wired Magazine, the print version of it. NPR News, that's National Public Radio in the US. Vogue, Univision, Telemundo, which are more based in the US, but there's a lot here that also is global, like CNN International. And so the reason I'm sharing this with you is when this started to happen and people started to contact me to learn about who I am and what I've done in tech, I used this opportunity to focus on something that has always been very dear to my heart. And that was to continue to inspire, empower, and educate listeners through a relatable story. And that story being my story. A story that I'll be sharing with you guys in more depth than any of these interviews, because I think there's something here that maybe you can borrow from, be inspired by, duplicate, mimic, I don't know. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but I'm pretty sure you'll find it at least inspiring. And so to answer that original question of how did this little girl end up in tech, I have to talk a little bit about my background. So in the early 80s, I was born in Colombia. At a time when Colombia wasn't doing that well, politically speaking. And so my family took this opportunity to say, I think Angie, in this case me, should probably move abroad. And that took me to live in Florida, in a very small island called Key Largo, which is just south of Miami, very different than my hometown in Colombia of Bogota. And there I had to confront learning a new language, finding new friends, adapting to a new culture, and so on. And the thing I want to point out here is I didn't speak English. I learned it all as I was going through school. And so one of the things that I resorted was creativity. And through creativity, I learned at a very young age the power of solving solutions, or solving problems, excuse me. And that really has played a huge role in the way I approach tech spaces. And so by being a creative person, growing up in a household of architects and people that were very passionate about finding solutions, I became known as kind of the artist in the classroom. And so much so that I would actually communicate with drawings long before I could speak English. So as I was drawing, I was also drawing a crowd of people around me going, oh, she can draw. And so from that point forward, every year I was winning awards in the drawing class and in art school and all of this, and that eventually got me to go to the Rhode Island School of Design, where I got 2 degrees, one in industrial design as an undergrad, and towards the end of my undergrad, I discovered graphic design, at which point I applied to graduate school, and I got my master's in graphic design. And just before I finished my career in college, I got an amazing job opportunity to work in California as an intern a year before graduating. And so that brought me to California, where now I've been there for about 11 years working in tech. And then I finished my degree after my internship and came back. So throughout these 11 years, I've worked on a number of products that I'll get to talk to in a little bit. And having done that, I'm pretty confident in saying that I have helped shape the way we all communicate, the way we share content, and the way we interact with our environment by leading and co-designing experiences at companies like Apple, Airbnb, and most recently at Google. And when I look back at my career and I see the products that I've worked on, they're all really fun, but they had kind of one thing in common. When you think of messages, for example, and designing that experience as a designer, or redesigning mail on OS X, or working on FaceTime from scratch, or designing the Apple emoji as an intern before they ever launched, and then moving into Airbnb and redesigning their app, then eventually working at Google on the Google Assistant, they all share this commonality about communication, which is really fascinating. I didn't purposely pick these projects or these applications, but they all share that underlying theme. And the other thing that I want to point out is that each company, these 3 companies, really taught me key lessons. Some obvious and others a bit unexpected, which you will get to hear a little bit about as I keep talking. But that sort of takes me to kind of the core of my talk, which is discussing my approach to this industry and the top takeaways I've encountered along the last decade. And so to open up the conversation about approach, to me, it's about discovering solutions through what I call fearless intuition. And one of my approaches has always been through creativity. As a young child, as I mentioned, I had to figure things out rapidly without any instructions. I had to figure out how to connect with my classmates, how to do well in reading and in math long before I could really speak the language. And all these other things started to happen, which at the time may have seemed like huge obstacles. But in reality, it was just training me to be really good at this. And so one of the things I mentioned is I didn't speak English, so I was more accustomed to saying hola instead of hello. But through my drawing ability, even though it looks like chicken scratch, I was able to communicate very rapidly. And so what I learned, what I was talking about earlier, is this notion of finding creative solutions instead of seeing blocks and doors closing in on you at a very, very young age. And so this kept happening throughout my lifetime, just making me really strong at being creative. The other thing that happened as I was progressing in school in Florida around the age of 12 or 13 is I basically became the interpreter for my mom. She did not speak English, And so long before Google Translate was a thing, I was her Google Translator, and she was its #1 client. And this would happen at the grocery store or anywhere she went. And what I learned here, again, when I was fairly young, was this notion of empathy instead of putting rejection in front of her. And I think as designers and even developers, I would argue empathy is what moves the world. It's really what makes us awesome at what we do and create beautiful products. So again, learning that approach very young and carrying that through my career has really made me more conscientious about this topic. And then the second piece to my approach also started quite young, in a matriarchy kind of format in my family. I'm the youngest of 5 sisters. My oldest sister is 20 years older than me. And my mom was pretty much the head of the household. When I was 7, my dad unfortunately passed away, leaving my mom to take the reins and figure out what to do with 5 ladies. And the beautiful thing that came out of this, despite this unfortunate event, was I learned and I saw firsthand that women could do anything. I saw my sisters go through university, getting married if they wanted to, having kids if they wanted to, working, etc., seamlessly, simply, just gracefully. And that applied to me. I could assume that I could do anything. I could walk into a room and just go for whatever goal I wanted. And I thought that was very, very important in this discussion about my approach, because not a lot of girls, perhaps, have that opportunity to be raised in that kind of environment. And so the other interesting thing that happened in this matriarchy, as I pointed out, I was the youngest of my sisters, was this notion that when I got to college and I applied to grad school, and I was waitlisted actually, because I think the people heading up the department thought I was too young to be in grad school. One of the things that I relied on was this relationship I had with my sisters, where it wasn't about our differences in age, but rather how can we be friends. And so I think that's really what got me into graduate school, because I did not see my peers as so different, but rather how do we work together in a team. And that was something that I picked up in college based on my younger years. And then I moved into the professional realm. You might think, oh, she was probably one of the few women in the meeting, and yes, that was true. To this day, I remember the first meeting I walked in at Apple, and it was 5 guys, all engineers, and myself, the designer. And I never for once thought, I'm the girl in the room. In fact, I thought, just like when I was young, I'm the designer in the room. And I thought that was really important as I reflect back through my lifetime so far, is having that kind of confidence, that type of vision that you have of yourself as opposed to what you think somebody else may think of you. And so here's a perfect example of me seeing equal expectations of everyone versus how and what they look like. And this, again, sounds very simple, but that's really how I've operated in my entire career. It's about equal expectations. You are the engineer in the room or the designer in the room or what have you. I'm not just the girl in the room. And so this kind of reflection about being fearless went from school to college into my professional realm. And that's kind of like the high summary of what this concept of being fearless is all about, which then takes me into my takeaways. What did I learn at each of these companies in order to be forward-thinking? And that's the other half that I like to focus on. So at Apple, as I mentioned, I was part of a 2-person team that co-designed the original Apple emoji. It was 2008, in the height of the economic recession in the US, and I landed this amazing internship. And what a way to enter tech as a graduate student and work on this project. At the time, I had no idea where these little icons would end up. It wasn't actually something that I worried about. I was more interested in meeting as many people as I could, finding cool places to hang out in San Francisco, and making sure I did a good job so that I could be hired full-time the year after. But I also learned a lot. my mentor, who was the other designer, Raymond, taught me a ton about design. And at the time, Apple ran on very small teams. I'm not sure how they operate these days, but when I was there, it was a very, very small group of people working on tons of projects, tons of applications. And so it was really fascinating to see how these folks, these amazing, talented designers, took something from nothing and created amazing products. And upon graduating, I was offered a full-time job. And one of the first projects that I was given was to redesign Apple Mail on the desktop. And I was warned. They said, Steve Jobs uses this app more than any other app. So anyone who touches it is risking a lot. You're going to hear it. And it was really interesting because my engineering partner, who was the manager for that team, really believed that we could pull this off, but not very many people did besides the two of us. And of course, they had to give it to the newbie, the junior designer on the team, right? So I said, let's try it and give it a shot. And throughout the course of the year, we kept experimenting with different things, and eventually it was time for Steve to review it. And I was very nervous, just given the atmosphere, but I was so happy to hear that he really liked it. And a few days later, he even called our director and said that he loved this, and that's how I got my first spot bonus. I wasn't shocked. I was like, oh, okay. I guess, when we collaborate, we do really great work together. It pays off. And the other thing I want to point out about Apple at the time was, as a designer on this very small team, you own the entire app. There was one designer per application. So in Mail, I was the only person working on Mail. Granted, we always talked, we always gave each other feedback, but it was one designer per product, and in many times you worked in multiple applications for one release. So that's how I ended up on Messages, Mail, FaceTime. And that gave me a lot of insights into what it's like to go from a sketch, an idea, into delivering final designs, getting them approved, explaining an idea through storytelling, redlining, implementation reviews, and so on. And the other really cool thing about Apple was, like you probably know, there's always a demo in a keynote. And seeing Steve at the time present your own work was really fascinating. I loved how he really was a great storyteller and just very thoughtful and caring in everything that he did. So this was pretty fun times as well. And to summarize my time at Apple, I've sort of highlighted the parts that I believe were really big takeaways for me at the time in my career that I was in. It was about being a designer and understanding that process. The power of storytelling. How do you tell the executive about the flow of this application from A to B to C? How do you collaborate with hundreds of engineers because you're working on so many things so rapidly and other designers in a really great way? What is this concept about gut checking, which I could talk for hours at some other point, but this notion of following your instinct to build great design? How do you do that? And also staying humble. As I mentioned previously, the peers that I was working with were really highly trained, well-seasoned designers, but they were some of the most down-to-earth, normal people you would ever imagine, to this day. And they are way more experienced than I think I ever will be. And so learning from people like that and keeping yourself grounded was also really cool. And I was at Apple for about 4.5 years, and then that took me into Airbnb, because I don't know if you can tell, I'm a very curious person. I always want to learn new things, and for me that meant being exposed to more cultures, more companies, more roles, etc. And so I wanted to see what the startup world was like, and I joined Airbnb in 2013. And they had tasked me with redesigning their hosting environment, so the hosting side of their application. And this was kind of the output that came out of that exercise. And you may think, oh, but that's so standard. You have your chat window, your calendar, the person that you're renting the space to, etc. But at the time, the app was actually quite different. And not being a host myself, I had to do a lot of research and putting myself in other people's shoes to make sure I understood how to do this. And so it was a really fun and rapid exercise, and I dove right in, so much so that I didn't even realize that I was supposed to work with a product manager, because at Apple they weren't there. And 3 months into this job, someone asks, "Who's your PM?" And I said, "What's a PM?" Whoops. But hey, we all learn. And then it shipped, and I believe it's still being used to this day with some visual updates to their iconography and so on. But it's really cool that the architecture that you helped construct is still there 5 years later. The other interesting thing that I saw at Airbnb was the power beyond just being a designer. Some of the vocabulary that I started to use throughout these storytelling, my demos, etc., contain words like host home. And when they launched this new upgrade to their platform, I was really excited to see that some of these words became part of their marketing campaign. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like, as a designer, you're not only responsible for crafting visual things or experiences or UIs, but also the sentiment, the feeling around a product. And I thought that was really powerful. And so to summarize what happened at Airbnb, it was all about the startup scene for me, understanding the behind the scenes of how a big, successful, beautiful startup like Airbnb operated. It was about true user testing, something that I had to do myself directly at times, how to work with the entire team, how the company culture evolved and retained, because the bigger you get, the harder possibly it is to have that culture stay intact. But also how to hustle, because as you probably know, startups require different things for each individual. So you're not just the designer, you might have to do many, many things across the board. And then eventually, I went over to Google. Again, curious about the culture, curious about the company, their products, new opportunities that I wanted to tackle. Because one thing to note here is, I don't know if you've gotten the rhythm, but I always sort of have a goal in mind, and I want to go for it. It's not a straight shot. There's lots of detours, but that's my plan. And so when I joined Google, I wanted to really work on their secret projects, Google X, and I got in, and they put me on Glass. And I was like, oh, okay. So we're going to see how this one evolves. And Glass was a really interesting team. It was the opportunity that showed me how the entire product line operated, not just on the UX and visual side, but operations, marketing, hardware, software, engineering, and so on. It was the first time I got to see how a miniature company, you could say, really operated from end to end. And I was fascinated by all of this. I have no regrets for ever working on a product like that with that kind of exposure. But after about 1.5 years, I realized I want to know what the real Google is all about. What is the search team about? What is this product, and how is it evolving? And so I joined the Google Assistant by means of Google Now, if any of you use that product. And I was one of the first designers on this product, the Assistant. I was also beginning to more formally manage people. I started managing people on Google Glass, but eventually became a manager as well into this organization. And that team grew, and I learned a lot along the way. We worked on products like TVs, speakers, mobile platforms, and so on. And so throughout Google, what I aimed to learn more about was about people, how to manage a group, how to mentor folks, how to have a life-work balance, if that's the right label, maybe it's not, but how to balance my time better. And I learned all of this in a really interesting way, I think. And so when I look back at this concept of being forward-thinking, I've basically walked you through my time at Apple, my time at Airbnb, and my time at Google, and what that all meant. But right now, in this moment in my life, when I combined what I said, fearless and forward, you get an entrepreneur. And this doesn't mean that this combination hasn't existed throughout my lifetime. It's always been present, but right now, in 2019, that's where I'm at. And so as an entrepreneur, I'm really excited in sharing with you guys kind of how I got here. while I was at Google, I kept asking myself, when is that moment that I'm going to feel really comfortable leaving a very comfortable job and do something that I've never done before? So for the course of 12 months, probably every month I checked in, and I asked myself, if I were to quit tomorrow, how am I going to feel? And every time for a year, the answer was regretful. Regretful that I won't have my coworkers next to me, afraid of working alone as opposed to with hundreds of people, worried about a consistent salary, and so on. But around Christmas time, I asked myself that question, and that was the first time I thought, I have no more regrets. So it took me a good year to get there, but those were sort of my criteria for making such a big decision. And I'm really excited to have given myself that opportunity. And then the other thing I was very conscientious of was finding this balance that I had experienced throughout my career at multiple stages. And I'm not Japanese, so I'm sorry I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but it's the sentiment of ikigai. This is a great illustration from a wonderful website that talks more in depth about it, but it's basically this merger between your passion, your mission, your profession, and your vocation. And I would really challenge all of you to try to figure out, what does that look like for you? For me, it was a variety of different elements that, unite to form this, but that's what I strive for. I want to find that thing that makes me super happy to work on, while still being able to, live a life, but also produce something that I think will be very useful. And that's kind of how I arrived at my startup, Tijiko. I left Google in January, so it's still in its baby phases. So I can't get too much into the details of what it is just yet, but in my opinion, and that's kind of the high goal, it's a new way to connect people that will be really human, really natural, as opposed to something that feels very robotic. And I did this based on a lot of the learnings, all of the things, the takeaways from these companies that I've experienced, blended with my approach. So understanding how to do storytelling, how to ship really high-quality products that billions of people still use to this day, along with being a creative solution designer and having a lot of empathy in your product, but also amongst your peers. Having this sense of friendship that I think we sometimes neglect in products that sometimes ship in the world, and also having equal expectations of those users and the peers and myself that all come together to form this new product. And so I want to note here that all this human quality really excites me because I've worked in communication, the space of communication, for a really long time. And I can tell you, obviously, technology has advanced very rapidly and beautifully, and it's helped us a ton. But as a mom and a human and a sister and a friend, one of the things that I also want to make sure we retain is the sentiment of human qualities. I want people to understand, especially younger folks, what empathy is about. So how can we design a product around this? Or what does friendship in a human-to-human level mean? I want to build the product around this. So those are core principles of my startup. And this is all happening from what I call my she shed. When I was leaving Google, I thought, okay, where can I work to find my ikigai? It can't be inside my home because I'll feel very kind of stuck in a box. So I said my backyard. So I installed the shed, and apparently they're called she sheds, which I didn't know, different than a man cave. And from there, it's obviously not my desk, that was just the beginning, but I'm surrounded by sun, which I love, my fruit trees, oranges, apricots, plums, my dog, and I have probably the shortest commute in Silicon Valley, 10 steps just outside my door. And I'm loving it. I'm loving what's happening here, the momentum, the people I'm working with, the people I'm connecting with, and for instance, working on our branding, what does this mean? Working on metrics, research, understanding market trends, all of these new things in some ways that I'm ramping up rapidly, but I'm very excited to learn about. So I would encourage that if you're interested in learning more, feel free to check out the website, tijiko.com, and you can stay in tune of our latest updates as they roll out. But the reason I'm kind of pausing here is to kind of look back at the beginning of this talk and to discuss these interviews that kept, coming my way. And one of the questions that I often got in these different media outlets from many countries was, what was it like to be a girl in tech or a woman in tech? Or what was it like to be a Latina in tech? And every time they asked me this question, my answer was very simple. I said, I loved it. I was just having fun. There was nothing unique about it. And the look in their face was very interesting because I think they were expecting answers very different from mine. And so as I was seeing this happen, I thought, why is this the case? Why did they expect the opposite? And that's how this conversation, this topic that I'm sharing with you guys, sort of came through. And my answer was, and this is a great quote from the Harvard Business publication, it's blocking my view, which was, to change the way you think, you first have to change the way you see. And that's really at the core of what I'm trying to deliver here, which is, if you want to be seen as the designer in the room or the engineer in the room, you first have to change the way you view your space before you start assuming things about yourself. So in my case, I never just saw myself as a girl. I always saw myself as a designer, and therefore I think people picked up on that, and that's kind of the reaction you will get from them. And to me, that's really interesting because that's exactly how you become fearlessly forward. It's that vision of the external space before you start judging your internal being. And I'll close by saying that that's exactly how this 8-year-old girl ended up working in the heart of Silicon Valley, was through fearlessness and forward intuition. So thank you so much. If you want to reach out, feel free to do so.
So we've got time for a few questions.
Sure.
One of the themes is talking about the differences you saw at the design process and how people made decisions at places like Apple, Airbnb, and Google. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you thought was similar and what you thought was different between them.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's see. I would say that at Apple, it was probably the place that did things quite differently than the other two I've worked at. We, for example, had to make very high-quality wireframes. There was no sketching on paper, at least during the time that I was there. So everything you made had to look like a product that would ship, because the end audience was Steve, and he would review and give you feedback. And it was fast. Every week we had to do these things. And so that was really interesting, the attention to quality and detail at such a rapid pace. At Airbnb, I really think it was about the culture, the sentiment, this feeling of belonging as they push on their marketing, because it was really true of their product and their design cycles. And at Google, it was a lot about experimenting quickly, not doing like super high-end sketches, because it was about iteration. So I think the blend of the three has been really fun to see.
And people are interested specifically about the Mail app. How many iterations did you have to go through to get that live?
A lot. Iteration was sort of building blocks. So it's like, imagine starting with a box of Legos. You have your base, and then you sort of start stacking things on it. That's how I see design process. It's not the number of variations, but rather the process, the journey. So I think it was a lengthy journey, but a good one.
A lot of people are seeing this sort of 2 or 3 year trend of saying a company and then trying another place, and you've sort of done something similar to that. Have you met people along the way who've done longer stints somewhere, and how has that contrasted to your experience?
Yeah, my mentor, Raymond, to this day still works at Apple. And I'm always fascinated to sort of ask him questions about how's it going versus how I'm doing, et cetera. And so I think I love to try new things, so I don't know if I could ever do that in one single company. But those that do stay for the long run also get a lot of benefits out of it. You really grow with the product, not just in age, but also experience, connections, networking, and the focus that you bring to those products.
Do you have any advice for people who are individual contributors who are looking to level up in a new way, maybe become managers?
Yeah, my best advice would be ask your own manager how they got into the manager role, because you'd be really surprised to hear the stories and the types of paths they took. Sometimes they were not planned or intended, but you also want to understand what managers like and what they don't like. Oftentimes we sort of just assume they're there to tell us what to do, but there's a lot of behind the scenes things that happen that would be great for someone interested in that career track to figure out before making that commitment.
And obviously in the news, sexism and discrimination in different ways in Silicon Valley is something that's a hot topic right now. How do you feel about that, having been there for 11 years now?
Yeah, that touches at the heart of this talk. I've never felt in that situation myself, but I feel like it's also very important to talk about the kind of the sentiment you can have to empower yourself, so that if you are ever faced with a situation like that, you have some sort of strength beneath you to help you move forward and be strong and continue paving that awesome path that you're creating for your career. So if anyone ever is in that situation, definitely speak up, I would say. But there's also a lot of support on how to become more empowered as a female in tech, I think.
Fun question is, do you ever look at the emojis that people create now, and how do you feel about them? Do you ever think, oh, I would never do that?
I actually love looking at the upgrades, the evolution of the emoji, even for things that haven't changed a whole lot. I always wonder, what made them make those decisions? Why do they still keep the dress blue as opposed to another color? Sometimes things change completely, like the little backpack that I once drew. And so I'm just curious about the thinking behind it, I would say, is what strikes me.
Great. We're out of time, but thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good day.